Come on, deaf girl, show us what you got. That was 30 seconds before the Olympic gold medalist cleaned house. Ryan Martinez stood in the center of his dojo that Tuesday night, black belt tied tight around his waist, pointing directly at the woman with the mop. His voice carried across the training floor to 15 students and their parents, dripping with the kind of arrogance that comes from never being truly challenged. I said, fight me! Ryan's voice grew louder, more theatrical. Or are you too scared and deaf? Keisha Washington looked up from her cleaning, water dripping steadily from the mop strands. She'd been invisible in this place for 8 months, cleaning after hours, staying in the shadows, letting everyone assume she was just another minimum wage worker grateful for the job. The room went quiet. Parents shifted uncomfortably. Students stared. But what none of them knew, what Ryan was about to discover the hard way, was that some people choose to be underestimated. 3 years of hiding were about to end in 30 seconds of truth. 2 hours earlier, Keisha had arrived at Sunset Valley Martial Arts just as she did every Tuesday and Thursday evening. Her key turned in the back door with practiced silence. She moved through the dojo like water, methodical and invisible. The place smelled of sweat and determination. Rubber mats stretched across the main floor, mirrors reflecting the overhead lights she flicked on one by one. She'd learned the routine by heart. Vacuum first, then mop, then wipe down equipment. Simple work that paid for her small apartment and kept her busy enough to avoid thinking too much. But Keisha never just cleaned. She watched. As she ran the vacuum along the edges of the training area, her peripheral vision tracked every technique the evening class practiced. The way that brown belt telegraphed his punches, how the teenage girl in the back row had perfect form but held back her power. The subtle adjustments Ryan made to students' stances that actually improved their balance. Ryan Martinez had talent, no question. At 28, he'd earned his third-degree black belt through genuine skill. Students respected him. Parents trusted him with their kids. But there was something else there. Something that made Keisha's jaw tighten when she watched him work, the way he dismissed certain students, the impatience that flickered across his face when someone struggled, the jokes that weren't quite jokes. Tonight, the evening class was winding down when Keisha heard car doors slamming in the parking lot. She glanced through the window and saw Maria Santos walking toward the entrance, her 10-year-old son Aiden bouncing beside her. Keisha knew them. Aiden had started coming 3 weeks ago, bright-eyed and eager, his hands moving in rapid sign language as he communicated with his mother. The boy was deaf, just like Keisha, but where she had learned to navigate the hearing world through careful observation, Aiden still moved with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood. The front door chimed as they entered. Maria signed something to Aiden, who grinned and ran toward the mat where Ryan was finishing up with the advanced students. Keisha watched Ryan's face change the moment he spotted them. Not outright hostility, but something colder, a tightening around his eyes. "Mrs. Santos," Ryan called out, his voice carrying that particular tone adults used when they were about to deliver disappointing news. "I was hoping to catch you." Maria approached with Aiden practically vibrating with excitement beside her. "Is everything okay? Aiden's been looking forward to class all week." Ryan glanced at the boy, who was stretching near the mat, completely unaware of the conversation happening about him. "Look, I've been thinking. This might not be the best fit for Aiden." "What do you mean?" Maria's voice stayed level, but Keisha could see her shoulders stiffen. "Martial arts requires a lot of verbal instruction. Commands, corrections, safety calls. Aiden can't hear any of that." Ryan gestured toward the other students. "It's not fair to him, and honestly, it's a distraction for the other kids." Keisha's hand tightened around the mop handle. She'd seen Ryan work with struggling students before, the overweight kid who couldn't keep up, the shy girl who flinched at contact. He'd shown patience then, made accommodations, found ways to help them succeed. "But he's been doing so well," Maria said. "He follows the visual cues, watches the other students. His balance and coordination are actually improving." Mrs. Santos, I appreciate your optimism, but this isn't a therapy session. It's martial arts. Real martial arts requires discipline, focus, the ability to respond instantly to instruction. Ryan's voice carried to the remaining students who had stopped their conversations to listen. Maybe you should look into some of those special programs. You know, for kids with needs. The word hung in the air like smoke. Aiden, blissfully unaware, continued his stretching routine, his movements surprisingly fluid for a 10-year-old. He doesn't need a special program, Maria's voice grew firmer. He needs the same chance as any other kid, the chance to feel strong, capable. Strong? Ryan let out a short laugh. Look, I'm not trying to be cruel here, but let's be realistic. The kid can't even hear instructions properly. How's he supposed to defend himself if he can't hear an attacker coming? That's when Keisha moved. She didn't plan it. One moment she was standing by the supply closet, invisible as always. The next, she'd taken 3 steps toward the conversation, mop still in hand. Ryan noticed her approach and turned, irritation flashing across his face. Can I help you with something? Keisha stopped. Around the dojo, conversations died. Parents and students turned to watch. Even Aiden looked up from his stretching, sensing the shift in atmosphere. She met Ryan's gaze directly, her dark eyes steady and unblinking. Then she looked at Aiden, who was watching the exchange with growing confusion. Back to Ryan. She shook her head once, a small but definitive gesture. Excuse me? Ryan's voice rose. Are you trying to tell me how to run my dojo? Keisha didn't respond. Couldn't respond in the way he expected. But her message was clear enough. The room felt it. Ryan looked around at his audience, students, parents, all watching this bizarre standoff between him and the cleaning lady. His face flushed red. This is unbelievable, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Now the cleaning lady wants to coach martial arts. A few uncomfortable chuckles from the students. Maria's face went pale. Aiden, reading the tension, if not the words, moved closer to his mother. Lady, I don't know what you think you know about teaching martial arts, Ryan continued, his voice gaining momentum. But I've been doing this for 15 years. I have actual credentials, actual experience, not just, he gestured at her mop, whatever this is. Keisha's expression didn't change. She simply stood there, holding his gaze, holding the space. And that, somehow, made Ryan even angrier. Ryan stepped closer to Keisha, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a reasonable tone, but in the silence of the dojo, every word carried. Look, I get it. You see a kid getting some tough love and you want to help. That's admirable, I guess. But you don't understand what we're doing here. This isn't daycare. This is serious training. Keisha remained motionless, her hands resting on the mop handle. But something in her posture had shifted. Where before she'd seemed to fold into herself, now she stood straighter, more centered. Ryan misread her stillness as submission. He turned back to Maria, raising his voice for the room. Mrs. Santos, I'm trying to be professional here, but when the cleaning staff starts questioning my methods, that's when Aiden approached the group. The boy had been watching their faces, reading the tension in their bodies, and his own face was scrunched with worry. He tugged on his mother's sleeve and signed rapidly. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she watched her son's hands. She turned to Ryan, her voice thick with emotion. He's asking why everyone looks angry. He wants to know if he did something wrong. Ryan glanced at the boy, and for a moment, something like guilt flickered across his features. But then he caught sight of the watching parents and students, and his expression hardened again. This is exactly what I'm talking about, he said. The constant need for special accommodation. The disruption to class flow. Other kids shouldn't have to worry about... Keisha moved. She didn't make a sound, but her movement cut through Ryan's words like a blade. She leaned the mop against the wall and stepped forward, positioning herself between Ryan and Aiden. Her hands moved in fluid sign language, and Aiden's worried expression transformed into a wide smile. Whatever she'd signed to him, it made the boy stand taller. Ryan stared at this exchange, his mouth slightly open. You know sign language? Keisha looked at him and nodded once. So you've been understanding everything? His voice climbed higher. This whole time, you've been listening to a private conversation between me and a parent? She nodded again. The room was electric with tension. Parents whispered to each other. Students fidgeted, unsure whether to leave or stay. Marcus Chen, one of the senior brown belts, stepped closer. Sensei Ryan, Marcus said quietly, maybe we should... No. Ryan's voice cracked like a whip. This is my dojo, my school, and I'm not going to be undermined by... He gestured at Keisha with barely contained fury. By someone who mops floors for a living. He turned to face the room, playing to his audience now. Can you believe this? The deaf cleaning lady thinks she knows better than a third-degree black belt. What's next? Should I ask her opinion on our belt testing procedures? A few students shifted uncomfortably. The laughter Ryan was fishing for didn't come. Keisha remained calm, but her eyes never left his face. She raised one hand and pointed to herself, then to the mat. The gesture was unmistakable. Ryan's jaw dropped. Are you challenging me? She nodded. This is insane. Ryan ran his hands through his hair, looking around the room as if seeking allies. She's challenging me to fight. The deaf cleaning lady wants to fight a black belt instructor. But something had changed in the room's energy. Where before the parents and students had seemed uncomfortable with the conflict, now they were leaning forward, paying attention in a different way. Sarah Kim, mother of one of the younger students, spoke up. Maybe you should just let it go, Ryan. She's just trying to help. Let it go? Ryan's voice rose to a near shout. She's disrespecting everything we stand for here. You don't just walk into someone's dojo and... Keisha stepped onto the mat. The action was so simple, so direct, that it stopped Ryan mid-sentence. She stood in the center of the training area, her worn sneakers squeaking slightly against the rubber surface. Her work clothes, faded jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, looked out of place among the crisp white GIs. But her stance didn't look out of place at all. Ryan stared at her for a long moment. Around the room, conversations died completely. Even the youngest students seemed to sense they were witnessing something significant. Fine, Ryan said finally, his voice carrying across the dojo. You want to do this? Let's do this. He stepped onto the mat, his movements sharp with anger and wounded pride. But we're doing this right. Full contact. No holding back. No special treatment because you're deaf, or a woman, or work here. Keisha didn't react to his words, but her eyes tracked his movement with an intensity that made several parents exchange glances. When I win, Ryan announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, and I will win, you pack up your cleaning supplies and find somewhere else to work. Deal? Keisha looked around the room, meeting the eyes of students and parents. When her gaze found Aiden, the boy was watching her with a mixture of worry and excitement. She nodded to him, then turned back to Ryan. She extended her hand. Ryan looked at it suspiciously. What? Keisha gestured to his hand, then to hers. A handshake, agreement. You're really going to do this. Ryan's voice carried disbelief and growing anticipation. The cleaning lady really thinks she can take on a black belt. He reached out and grasped her hand, squeezing harder than necessary. Keisha didn't flinch, but when their hands separated, Ryan flexed his fingers unconsciously. Tomorrow night, he announced to the room. 7 p.m. Full class as witnesses. He turned back to Keisha. I hope you're prepared for the consequences of your choices. But as he spoke, Marcus Chen had moved closer to get a better look at Keisha. His eyes widened slightly as he took in details others had missed. The calluses on her hands, the way she balanced on the balls of her feet, the controlled breathing that spoke of years of training. Sensei, Marcus said quietly, maybe we should... Tomorrow night, Ryan repeated, cutting him off. 7 p.m. sharp. Don't be late. Keisha nodded once more, then walked calmly off the mat. She picked up her mop and returned to her cleaning as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed, and everyone in the room knew it. The dojo buzzed with nervous energy as word spread about tomorrow night's match. Parents gathered in small clusters, their voices low but urgent. Students who'd been getting ready to leave suddenly found reasons to linger. David Park, the dojo owner, emerged from his office in the back, drawn by the unusual commotion. A stocky man in his 50s with graying temples, he'd built Sunset Valley Martial Arts from nothing over 20 years. He took pride in running a respectful professional school. "What's going on out here?" David's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing teenage egos and parental concerns. Ryan straightened, suddenly aware that his boss had witnessed at least part of the confrontation. "Just a minor disagreement about teaching methods." "A disagreement that involves challenges to fight?" David's eyes swept the room, taking in the tense faces, the way people were grouped around the mat like spectators at an accident. Marcus Chen stepped forward. "Sensei Park, Ryan challenged the cleaning lady to a match tomorrow night. Full contact." David's eyebrows rose. He looked from Ryan to Keisha, who was methodically mopping the far corner, apparently oblivious to the attention. "Is this true?" "She challenged me first," Ryan said quickly. "She was interfering with how I handle my students, questioning my authority in front of parents. I had to respond." "You had to challenge a deaf woman who works here to a fight?" "She's not just some helpless victim." Ryan's voice grew defensive. "She made her choice. She stepped onto the mat." David walked over to where Keisha was working. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral but alert. "Keisha," David said, speaking slowly and clearly so she could read his lips. "Is this something you really want to do?" She nodded without hesitation. "You understand this could be dangerous? Ryan's a skilled fighter." Another nod, more emphatic this time. David studied her face for a long moment. In 8 months of employment, Keisha had been punctual, thorough, and completely professional. Never late, never complained, never caused problems. But there was something in her eyes now that he'd never seen before. A quiet intensity that reminded him of fighters he'd known in his younger days. "All right," David said finally, turning back to the room. "If both parties consent, I won't stop this, but we do it properly." He walked to the center of the mat, his voice carrying to every corner of the dojo. "Tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Official match with proper rules and safety protocols. I'll referee personally." Ryan's confident smile faltered slightly. He'd expected David to shut this down, not legitimize it. "Full contact as agreed," David continued, "but with reasonable limits. No strikes to the head, no joint locks, no throws that risk serious injury. First to submit or be unable to continue loses." "That's not what we agreed," Ryan protested. "She challenged me. She should face the real consequences." "These are the real consequences." David's voice hardened. "In my dojo, under my insurance, with my rules. Don't like it? Take your disagreement to the parking lot." Ryan's face flushed, but he nodded. "Fine, but the stakes remain the same. When I win, she finds another job." David turned to Keisha. "And if you win?" Keisha looked thoughtful for a moment, then walked over to where Aiden stood with his mother. She knelt down to the boy's level and signed something to him. Aiden's face lit up, and he signed back rapidly. Maria Santos translated, her voice shaky with emotion. She says if she wins, Aiden gets to stay in class. No more talk about special programs or accommodations. He gets treated like every other student." "That's it?" Ryan laughed. "That's her big demand? The kid can stay in class?" Keisha stood and faced him directly. She signed something fluid and decisive. "What did she say?" Ryan demanded. Marcus Chen, who'd picked up some sign language from a deaf cousin, translated quietly. She said, "That's everything." The room fell silent again. Parents looked at each other with new understanding. This wasn't about ego or pride. This was about a child's right to belong. David nodded slowly. "Those are the terms. 7 p.m. tomorrow. Official witnesses required. I want at least 10 people here to make this legitimate." He looked around the room, his expression serious. "Anyone who attends is bound by what they see. No social media, no recordings, no gossip that could damage anyone's reputation. This stays between us." Keisha removed her cleaning gloves, and for the first time, people got a clear look at her hands. The calluses were obvious now, thick ridges across her palms and knuckles that spoke of years gripping something much more demanding than a mop handle. Marcus Chen sucked in a quiet breath. Those weren't the hands of a cleaning lady. "Tomorrow, then," Ryan said, his voice trying to maintain confidence but betraying a note of uncertainty. "Don't expect me to go easy on you just because—" But Keisha had already turned away, returning to her work as if the conversation was over. She moved with a fluid efficiency that seemed different now, more purposeful, like someone who knew exactly what they were preparing for. As parents gathered their children and students collected their gear, the dojo slowly emptied. But the anticipation hung in the air like incense, thick and impossible to ignore. Tomorrow night, everything would change. Keisha's apartment sat above a Korean restaurant on the east side of town, the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business and rent stayed affordable. She climbed the narrow stairs, her work clothes still smelling faintly of cleaning products, her mind replaying the evening's events. The apartment was sparse but clean. A small living room with a second-hand couch, a kitchen table for one, a single bedroom with blackout curtains. But it was the walls that told the real story, or rather, what wasn't on them. Picture frames sat face down on the dresser in her bedroom. A small wooden box on the nightstand remained firmly closed. The only visible photograph was on the refrigerator. Keisha with her arm around a younger girl, both of them grinning at the camera, both making exaggerated muscle poses. Emma. Keisha touched the photo gently, the way she did every night before bed. Emma at 14, all elbows and attitude, her hearing aids visible but worn like badges of honor. Emma who'd taught Keisha that being deaf didn't mean being weak, just different. Emma who'd been so proud when her big sister made the Paralympic team. Emma who wasn't here anymore. Keisha moved to the bedroom and knelt beside the bed, reaching underneath to pull out a gym bag she hadn't opened in 3 years. The zipper stuck slightly from disuse, but inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it. Hand wraps, worn soft from countless training sessions, a mouthguard, molded specifically for her teeth. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, a gold medal that caught the lamplight like a promise. Rio de Janeiro 2016. Women's Judo, 57 kgs division. First place. She lifted the medal carefully, feeling its familiar weight. The ribbon was slightly faded, but the gold still gleamed. Keisha Washington, Paralympic champion. The deaf girl from Oakland who'd shocked the world with her technical precision and devastating ground game. The girl who'd retired at 25 after the accident that took her hearing completely, and her sister forever. She closed her eyes and the memories came flooding back. Not of victory podiums or magazine covers, but of the phone call that changed everything. Emergency room, critical condition, Emma's motorcycle, a distracted driver, a moment of inattention that destroyed 2 lives in different ways. Emma had been riding to surprise Keisha at training camp. She'd gotten her license just that month, was so excited to finally visit her big sister at the Olympic Training Center. The doctor said she'd died instantly. They said it like that was supposed to be a comfort. The hearing loss had come later, a delayed consequence of the traumatic brain injury Keisha sustained when she collapsed upon hearing the news. Sudden sensorineural hearing loss, the doctors called it. Stress-induced. Sometimes it came back, they said. Usually it didn't. 3 years of silence. 3 years of guilt. 3 years of avoiding everything that reminded her of who she used to be. But tonight, watching Aiden's face when Ryan suggested he didn't belong, she'd seen Emma, heard Emma's voice in her memory, clear as a bell. "Keisha, will you always protect me?" She'd failed Emma. She couldn't fail Aiden. Keisha stood and moved to her closet, pushing aside work uniforms to reveal clothes she hadn't worn in years. Athletic wear, training gear, a worn gray hoodie with Team USA printed across the chest in faded letters. She pulled out a pair of training shorts and a compression shirt, holding them up to the light. They still fit. She'd never stopped moving, never stopped the subtle training that kept her body ready even when her mind wasn't. Shadowboxing in her apartment late at night, stretching routines that maintained flexibility, strength exercises disguised as cleaning work. The muscle memory was all there, waiting. She walked to the bathroom mirror and studied her reflection. At 31, she looked older than her years. The stress of loss had carved lines around her eyes, and her hair was longer than she'd worn it as a competitor. But underneath, the athlete remained. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand, a text message. She picked it up, expecting spam or a work reminder. Instead, it was from Maria Santos. "Thank you for standing up for Aiden today. I don't know what you're planning tomorrow, but please be careful. He's been talking about you all evening. Says you're the first adult who treated him like he belonged somewhere. That means everything to a mom. Whatever happens, we'll be there." Keisha stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed back, "See you at 7. She returned to the gym bag and pulled out her old training journal, its pages filled with technique notes, competition analysis, training schedules written in her careful handwriting. She flipped to a page near the back, one she'd written after her last competition. Judo is about more than throwing people. It's about using an opponent's force against them. It's about staying calm when someone tries to overpower you. Most importantly, it's about protecting what matters. I forgot that for a while, but some lessons you never really lose." At the bottom of the page, in Emma's messy teenage scrawl, she'd written, "My sister is the strongest person I know. Not because she can throw people around, but because she makes other people feel safe. That's her real superpower." Keisha traced the words with her finger, feeling their weight. Tomorrow night wasn't about proving herself to Ryan or even protecting Aiden, though both mattered. It was about remembering who she'd been before grief convinced her to hide. She repacked the bag carefully, leaving out only the hand wraps. Those she placed on her nightstand next to Emma's photo. As she got ready for bed, Keisha's movements carried a precision they hadn't held in years. The way she balanced while brushing her teeth, how she unconsciously checked her stance while washing her face, the controlled breathing that regulated her heartbeat. The cleaning lady was still there, the one who'd learned to be invisible, who'd found safety in being underestimated. But tomorrow night, she'd step back into the light as someone else entirely. Someone who'd forgotten, for just a while, that silence could be its own kind of strength. Someone who was ready to remember. Before turning off the lights, she sent one more text message, this one to David Park. "Thank you for making this official. 7 p.m. sharp." His reply came immediately. "Are you sure about this, Keisha? Ryan's good, but he fights angry. That makes him dangerous." She typed back slowly, "I've been fighting angry for 3 years. Tomorrow, I fight for something better." Outside her window, the city hummed with late-night energy. Inside her small apartment, surrounded by memories of loss and reminders of who she used to be, Keisha Washington settled into the deepest sleep she'd had in months. Tomorrow, everything would change, for everyone. The dojo filled differently on Wednesday night. Parents arrived early, claiming seats along the walls like spectators at a championship bout. Students who normally left after class lingered with nervous energy. Even some of the afternoon students had returned, drawn by word of mouth and curiosity. Keisha entered through the back door at exactly 6:45 p.m., carrying a small duffel bag instead of her usual cleaning supplies. She'd traded her work clothes for black athletic shorts and a plain gray t-shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her feet were bare. The conversations died as she walked across the dojo floor. Where before she'd moved like someone trying to remain invisible, now every step carried purpose. Her posture was straighter, her gaze direct. She looked, several parents realized with surprise, like an athlete. Ryan was already warming up on the mat, his movements sharp and aggressive. He wore his traditional white gi with the black belt knotted perfectly around his waist. His warm-up routine was impressive. High kicks, spinning techniques, combinations that showcased his flexibility and power. He was putting on a show, and he knew it. David Park stood at the edge of the mat, wearing his instructor uniform and carrying a clipboard. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes tracked Keisha's movements with growing interest. "All right, everyone," David called out. "We're going to do this properly. Official rules, official witnesses. No phones, no recording devices, no social media posts. What happens here stays here." Aiden sat in the front row with his mother, his eyes wide with excitement and worry. When Keisha passed near him, she paused and signed something quickly. The boy's worried expression transformed into a smile, and he signed back enthusiastically. Marcus Chen, watching from across the room, felt his stomach tighten. He'd spent the day thinking about those calluses on Keisha's hands, about the way she'd moved during last night's confrontation. Something about her reminded him of his college wrestling coach, that same controlled intensity that spoke of serious training. "Fighters to the center," David announced. Ryan strode to the middle of the mat with confident swagger, bouncing slightly on his toes, rolling his shoulders. Keisha approached from the opposite side, her movement economical and fluid. They stood facing each other, 3 feet apart. The contrast was stark. Ryan in his crisp white gi, tall and lean with the defined musculature of someone who trained for appearance as much as function. Keisha in simple workout clothes, shorter and stockier, her build suggesting functional strength over aesthetic muscle. "Standard rules," David announced to the room. "No strikes to the head, no small joint manipulation, no throws that risk serious neck or spine injury. Match ends with submission, unconsciousness, or referee stoppage." He looked at both fighters. "Understood?" Ryan nodded curtly. Keisha bowed slightly, a gesture so natural it seemed instinctive. "Touch gloves and return to your corners." They stepped forward. Ryan extended his hand aggressively, trying to intimidate with his grip strength. Keisha met his hand calmly, her own grip solid but not competing. When they separated, Ryan flexed his fingers again, just as he had the night before. They returned to opposite sides of the mat. The room held its breath. "Begin!" Ryan came forward immediately, his strategy clear. Use his reach and aggression to overwhelm her before she could settle into any kind of rhythm. He threw a series of probing punches and kicks, nothing committed, just testing her reactions. Keisha didn't retreat. Instead, she moved laterally, her footwork smooth and balanced. She kept her hands up in a guard that looked more like boxing than traditional martial arts, her body positioned at angles that made Ryan's strikes miss by inches. "Come on!" Ryan called out, his voice carrying to the spectators. "Don't just run around." But Keisha wasn't running. She was reading him. Every time Ryan committed to a technique, she was already moving away from it, her spatial awareness allowing her to see attacks before they fully developed. The first real exchange came when Ryan threw a hard right cross, followed by a low kick. Keisha slipped the punch with minimal movement and caught the kick, her hands locking around Ryan's ankle with surprising speed. For a moment, they were connected, Ryan hopping on one foot while Keisha controlled his trapped leg. The room expected her to sweep him or throw him off balance. Instead, she simply released his foot and stepped back. Ryan landed awkwardly, his confidence flickering for the first time. In the crowd, Marcus Chen leaned forward. That hand positioning when she'd caught the kick, he'd seen it before, in highlight reels of Olympic judo competitions. "What was that?" Ryan demanded, his breathing already slightly elevated. "You had me, and you just let go?" Keisha didn't respond, couldn't respond in the way he expected, but her message was clear in her posture, her expression. She was showing him something, giving him information he wasn't yet ready to understand. Ryan's next attack was more aggressive, a combination of punches followed by an attempt to grab her in a clinch. But when his hands reached for her, Keisha seemed to flow around them like water. Her movement was so smooth, so efficient, that Ryan found himself grasping air while she repositioned behind him. Again, she could have struck or thrown him. Again, she chose not to. The crowd began to murmur. This wasn't what they'd expected. Not the brutal confrontation Ryan had promised, but something more like a chess match played at fighting speed. "Stop playing games!" Ryan's frustration was building now, his techniques becoming sloppier as his anger grew. "Fight me!" But Keisha was fighting, just not in any way Ryan understood. Every exchange revealed more about his patterns, his tendencies, his weaknesses. She was learning him, downloading his fighting style like a computer analyzing data. 5 minutes in, Ryan was breathing hard while Keisha looked like she'd barely started warming up. Sweat darkened his GI, while her shirt remained dry. His movements were becoming wider, more telegraphed, as fatigue and frustration took their toll. The crowd's energy was shifting too. Parents who'd expected to see Ryan dominate were now watching with growing amazement as the cleaning lady systematically dismantled his offense without seeming to exert any effort. "She's making him look silly," Sarah Kim whispered to another mother. "Where did she learn to move like that?" came the reply. Ryan heard the whispers and his face reddened. He'd promised these people a demonstration of proper martial arts hierarchy. Instead, he was being embarrassed by someone who wasn't even fighting back. "Enough!" Ryan roared, abandoning technique for pure aggression. He rushed forward with a wild haymaker, putting all his power behind a punch designed to end the match. Keisha had been waiting for this moment. As Ryan committed fully to his attack, she stepped off the line of his punch and captured his extended arm. Her movement was so fast, so precise, that most spectators missed the technique entirely. One moment, Ryan was throwing his biggest punch. The next, he was airborne, rotating through space in a perfect arc, before landing hard on his back with Keisha controlling his arm in a textbook Jujigatame armbar. The room erupted in gasps and scattered applause. But instead of applying pressure to force a submission, Keisha held the position for just a moment, long enough for everyone to see how completely she controlled him, then released his arm and stood up. Ryan lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, his chest heaving. Around the room, parents and students processed what they'd just witnessed. That throw had been beautiful, technical, the kind of technique that took years to perfect. Marcus Chen was on his feet now, his face pale with recognition. He knew that throw. He'd seen it in competition footage, performed by Paralympic champions and Olympic medalists. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "Who is she?" Ryan rolled to his side, then pushed himself up to his knees. His GI was disheveled, his hair messed, his breathing labored. But it was his expression that had changed most dramatically, the arrogant confidence replaced by confusion and growing fear. "What the hell was that?" he gasped. Keisha extended her hand to help him up. The gesture was respectful, even gentle. But when Ryan looked into her eyes, he saw something that made him shiver. She wasn't even trying yet. And somehow, everyone in the room knew it. Ryan stared at Keisha's outstretched hand for a long moment before slapping it away and scrambling to his feet on his own. His face was flushed with embarrassment and growing desperation. "Lucky shot," he panted, adjusting his guy with shaking hands. "You caught me off guard." But everyone in the room had seen the truth. That hadn't been luck. That had been the kind of technical perfection that came from thousands of hours of practice, from muscle memory so deep it operated beyond conscious thought. David Park stepped closer to the edge of the mat, his referee's instincts alert. The dynamic had shifted completely. Ryan's breathing was ragged, his movements increasingly frantic, while Keisha remained centered and calm. "Ryan!" David called out, his voice carrying a warning. "Remember where you are." But Ryan was past hearing warnings. The whispers from the crowd, the way parents were looking at him now, not with respect but with something approaching pity. It was eating at him. His entire identity was built on being the expert, the authority figure. Without that, who was he? He came at Keisha again, this time abandoning any pretense of technique. Wild swings, desperate grappling attempts, the kind of sloppy brawling that had no place in a martial arts school. Keisha absorbed it all with minimal effort. She redirected his punches, stepped away from his kicks, and when he tried to tackle her, she simply wasn't where he expected her to be. The crowd watched in growing discomfort as Ryan's attacks became more reckless, more dangerous. This wasn't martial arts anymore. This was a man having a breakdown in public. "This is embarrassing," someone whispered. "Someone should stop this," came another voice. But Keisha seemed to understand something the spectators didn't. Ryan needed to reach the bottom before he could find his way back up. So she gave him space to fall, space to exhaust himself against her defense. 8 minutes into the match, Ryan threw a wild right hook that would have seriously injured Keisha if it had connected. But it didn't connect. She moved just enough to let it pass by her ear, and the momentum of his miss sent Ryan stumbling forward. That's when something inside him snapped. "Fight me!" he screamed, spinning around to face her. "Stop hiding! Stop running! Fight me like a man!" The words hung in the air like poison. Around the room, parents exchanged shocked glances. Students shifted uncomfortably. Even Aiden, who couldn't hear the shouted words, could read the ugly emotion on Ryan's face. Ryan raised his fist again, but this time there was something different in his eyes. Something that made David start forward from the edge of the mat. Keisha saw it too. The moment when frustration crossed the line into genuine violence. When technique gave way to the desire to hurt. She moved. Not away this time, but toward him. As Ryan's fist came down in a wild, uncontrolled strike aimed at her head, Keisha stepped inside his guard and caught his wrist. Her other hand came up and pressed gently against his chest, and she held him there. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they were frozen in that position. Ryan's fist trapped inches from Keisha's face, her hand resting over his heart. She looked up into his eyes, and for the first time in the match, he saw her truly see him. Not the black belt, not the instructor, not the authority figure. Just Ryan. Scared, angry, lost Ryan. Her expression wasn't triumphant or mocking. It was sad. Disappointed, maybe, but also compassionate. She shook her head slowly, a gesture so gentle it was almost maternal. No more. Ryan's face crumpled. The fight went out of him all at once, like air leaving a punctured balloon. His hand went limp in her grip, and she released it carefully. He stood there swaying slightly, his chest heaving, tears beginning to form in his eyes. The room was completely silent, everyone witnessing the collapse of a man who'd built his identity on being stronger than everyone else. Keisha stepped back and gestured toward the edge of the mat. The match was over. Not because anyone had submitted or been knocked unconscious, but because there was nothing left to fight. Ryan looked around the room at the faces staring back at him. Students, parents, colleagues, all seeing him as he really was, all understanding what he'd become. He walked off the mat without a word, his shoulders shaking. The silence that followed was deafening. The silence stretched for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Ryan stood at the edge of the mat, his back to the room, his shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. Parents and students waited, unsure whether to leave or stay, whether to comfort or confront. It was Aiden who broke the spell. The 10-year-old boy stood up from his seat in the front row and walked onto the mat. He approached Keisha, his hands moving in quick, excited sign language. Even those who couldn't understand sign could read the admiration and gratitude in his expression. Keisha knelt down to his level, her own hands responding with fluid grace. Whatever they were saying to each other, it made Aiden's face light up with pure joy. The exchange seemed to wake Ryan from his paralysis. He turned around slowly, his face streaked with tears he hadn't bothered to wipe away. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words were directed at Keisha, but they carried to every corner of the dojo. Parents leaned forward. Students stopped their quiet conversations. "I'm sorry," Ryan repeated, louder this time. "Not just for tonight, for yesterday. For every time I made someone feel like they didn't belong here." He looked directly at Aiden, who was still signing with Keisha. "Especially you, buddy. You belong here as much as anyone else. More than me, probably." David Park stepped onto the mat, his expression unreadable. As the dojo owner, he had authority here, the power to fire instructors who embarrassed his school. But he'd also seen something tonight that went beyond wins and losses. "Ryan," David said carefully, "why don't you take a seat?" Ryan nodded and moved to a bench along the wall, his movements heavy with exhaustion and shame. The crowd's attention turned back to Keisha, who was still kneeling with Aiden. Marcus Chen had been watching the entire exchange with growing recognition. During the match, he'd been trying to place where he'd seen those techniques before. Now, looking at the way Keisha moved, the way she carried herself, pieces were falling into place. "Keisha!" Marcus called out, his voice uncertain. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up at him and nodded. "Rio 2016, Women's Judo, 57-kilogram division." Marcus paused, studying her face. "That was you, wasn't it?" The room went electric. Parents who'd been pulling out their phones to Google stopped and stared. Students who barely knew what the Paralympics were suddenly understood they were in the presence of something extraordinary. Keisha stood slowly, Aiden moving to stand beside her. For a moment, she looked like she might deflect the question, retreat back into the anonymity she'd cultivated for 3 years. Instead, she nodded. "Holy shit," someone breathed from the back of the room. "Language," a parent corrected automatically, but their voice carried no real conviction. David Park's eyes widened as the implications hit him. "You're Keisha Washington, the Keisha Washington, the girl who came out of nowhere to win Paralympic gold." Another nod, smaller this time. "But why?" David gestured around the dojo, at the cleaning supplies still sitting by the door. "Why are you here, working as—" Keisha held up a hand, stopping the question. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of parents and students who'd watched her clean their training space for 8 months without truly seeing her. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying the slight accent of someone who'd learned to speak before losing their hearing. "Everyone deserves to feel strong," she said, the words coming slowly but with absolute conviction. "Everyone deserves to feel like they belong somewhere." She gestured toward Aiden, who beamed up at her. "This young man reminds me why I fell in love with martial arts in the first place. Not for the medals or the recognition, but for what it teaches us about ourselves." Her gaze found Ryan, still sitting on the bench with his head in his hands. True strength isn't about defeating others. It's about protecting those who need protection. It's about creating space for people to discover their own power. Maria Santos stood up from her seat, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing my son as more than his disability, for giving him a chance to belong." "He always belonged," Keisha replied. "Some of us just forgot how to see it." David Park stepped forward, his business owner's mind already processing the implications of having an Olympic champion working in his dojo. "Keisha, would you consider teaching? I mean, Officially, we could restructure your position, create a program for adaptive martial arts. I'll think about it, Keisha said. But first, there's something else that needs to happen. She walked over to where Ryan sat hunched on the bench. The room watched as she knelt down in front of him, bringing herself to his eye level. Ryan, she said gently. He looked up, his face a mess of tears and shame. You're a good teacher, she continued. I've watched you work with students for months. You have genuine skill, real knowledge. But somewhere along the way, you forgot that teaching isn't about being the strongest person in the room. Ryan's voice was hoarse when he spoke. How do I fix this? How do I come back from what I just did? The same way anyone learns martial arts, Keisha said. One day at a time, one student at a time, one choice at a time. She stood and extended her hand to him again. This time, Ryan took it without hesitation, letting her help him to his feet. I'd like to learn from you, Ryan said, his voice growing stronger. If you'll have me as a student. Keisha smiled for the first time all evening. Everyone starts as a beginner, even black belts. Around the room, the tension that had gripped the dojo for 2 days finally began to dissolve. Parents relaxed in their seats. Students started talking excitedly about what they'd witnessed. Aiden bounced on his toes, signing rapidly to his mother about his new hero. David Park clapped his hands once, bringing attention back to himself. All right, everyone. What we witnessed tonight stays in this room. We're a family here, and families protect each other. He looked at Keisha, then at Ryan, then at the assembled community. Tomorrow we start fresh. New programs, new opportunities, new ways of understanding what it means to be strong. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Keisha with handshakes, thanks, and quiet words of respect. Parents who'd barely acknowledged her existence now saw her clearly for the first time. But it was Aiden's reaction that mattered most to her. The boy signed something elaborate and enthusiastic, his face glowing with excitement. Maria translated through her tears. He says you're the first grown-up who fought for him instead of against him. He wants to know if you'll teach him to be brave like you. Keisha knelt down one more time, meeting Aiden's eager eyes. Her response was in sign language, but her meaning transcended words. You're already brave, she told him. Now let's learn to be strong. Outside the dojo, the world continued its regular rhythm. But inside these walls, everything had changed. A community had remembered what it meant to protect its most vulnerable members. A teacher had learned the difference between authority and leadership. And a woman who'd hidden in silence for 3 years had found her voice again. Sometimes the quietest person in the room really does have the loudest message. Sometimes strength isn't about what you can destroy, but what you choose to protect. And sometimes, the people who need our help the most are the ones who end up saving us.
This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of what happens when truth meets visibility. At Beat Stories, we believe exposure is the first step to transformation. Subscribe and stay tuned, because the next story might be yours.